Thank you, Tim. The topic here is actually thinking about the power of pull. You've heard a lot about this today, but kind of taking a platform approach to learning, building a little bit on what Jim was talking about a bit earlier. Tim already opened up the whole session on thinking about the iPad platform, the iPhone platform, how a small number of apps carefully deployed, cleverly deployed, has now led to 145,000, 200,000 new apps, so on and so forth. Can we do the same kind of thing in education? So we've got this conversation going. So to me, as I was thinking about this program, and also Tim, thinking about the architecture of participation and how in some sense government 2.0, you've been hearing a tremendous amount today, very exciting advances, coupled to learning 2.2, maybe these two things are two sides of the same coin of a new way to participate and a new way to learn. How do we actually shift from an entire world based on a push economy to a new way of participation through pull? And in fact, if you really think about it very much, you begin to recognize that we're kind of in a fix in the education arena because of the pace of change. It ain't slowing down, exponentially driven by the types of infrastructures all of us in this room know so well. That basically kind of the half-life of any particular skill is shrinking, shrinking, shrinking. And our ability to predict future needs is shrinking, shrinking, and becoming increasingly unpredictable and more uncertain. The trouble is we've built our entire systems of industry and entire systems of education built about the belief we could forecast the stocks of knowledge we ought to know, and then how to kind of deploy those stocks, if you wish, to the challenges that we're facing, for example, our students 20 years from now. And under that arena, the game, of course, was how do you get scalable efficiency that led to these beautiful classrooms and 15-minute hours and so on and so forth. But in fact, in the kind of world we're living in today, predictability has pretty much gone to zero, half-life is shrinking. So now the question is, how do we move from a world of stocks to a world of flows? And how do we actually think about richer participation on the edge of these flows as fundamental ways to learn and create knowledge? And in fact, my image here is how do we shift from the huge classrooms to something like Maker's Fair that Dale might be talking about in a few minutes from now. But we want to do this in a way that we produce students that actually have incredible curiosity that stays with them through life. Every kid starting out already has curiosity. The question is, how do we keep that going, and how do we develop what you might call a questing disposition so they're constantly looking for ways to pull new things in, pull resources around to get new things type of done. And I was really struck by this 2-year-old kid kind of watching over the shoulder of his 5-year-old sister in how to actually use iPhone to pull some information for that. Maybe a more typical example, one that happened not too long ago, is the way that basically iPhones, the ability to actually access and pull information on demand, has turned out to be a very interesting way to enrich conversations. At a dinner party, the issue of white truffles came up. Strange notion, white truffles. The question was, where are they? And how they actually harvest. Well, the person sitting in the middle said, actually sitting in the room right now, Anne said, oh, that's simple. Whips out her iPhone, gets into Google, and says, oh, yes, these come from northern Italy, and they're actually harvested by poodles, not pigs. And immediately the question happened, well, why is that the case? Why poodles, not pigs? And that turned out to be a very long, interesting conversation, exploring more about why white truffles have to be kind of harvested by poodles, where all the black truffles that we're used to are harvested by pigs. You can look that up in Google if you want to go through this. In that spirit, you got to ask, likewise, what would it mean if we actually rethink the whole notion of the books or books and libraries? And what would it mean for a book to get better the more it was used? Or the University of Michigan is asking the question, how does the library itself get better the more that it is used? A simple little example has just recently come up in terms of books that get, in some sense, better. This is a new feature in Amazon Kindle. And if you go to this great book called Open Government that came out of last year's conference in a way, and you can now look at this and see which passages of that book were underlined the most. In this particular case, although this feature is brand new, so it's not that many people underlining anything, but 6 people have picked up as the most popular thing to underline that part of the text that says government 2.0 is not a new kind of government. It is a government stripped down to its core, rediscovered, reimagined, as for the first time, blah, blah, blah. So now you begin to see this is the kind of thing that actually, the more this book is read, you begin to get a sense of what parts of the book, what lines, what sentences, what paragraphs in the book seem to communicate the best and most important information to the reader. Might this be a solution to the attention economy? Well, probably not, but nevertheless, it's heading in a very interesting direction. I want to talk about another thing tying up in the previous speaker in terms of an incubator called Startle that's been created recently in order to boost the ability for small businesses and individuals and students and teachers to create their own apps for things like iPad. And the way this thing gets going is they have actually a boot camp. This is going to be the second year. This is the announcement for the one coming up very, very soon, done between Startle and IDEO, called Design Boost. Is a 4-day boot camp where they actually prototype digital learning products and so on and so forth. Last year, one of the most successful products now is on the market as an app, came out. It's called NOAA, standing for Network Organisms and Habitats. And this lets you actually map out all kinds of plants and animals that could be around the country. You kind of fill it out, what you're finding there, and so on and so forth. You put it onto a Google map. You can actually dive into all these things to find out what's being discovered here versus there, et cetera. Here's a particularly interesting case that was kind of uncovered, a fairly unusual Dobson fly, eastern Dobson fly, that is a bit strange because this fly is 5 inches in diameter and a 10-inch wings structure. So it's a bit unusual. When these things get spotted, they get posted, and so on and so forth. And in fact, what makes this thing very interesting is that basically there's a set of professionals along with kids, along with students, along with amateurs, all working together here in order to warrant this information. So this really does become a sense of not only expert, but peer kind of mentoring and monitoring of the information going on. I actually got involved with this for looking at the trajectories of invasive plants that are happening to spread through Maine to see if you could actually get all the students there to be able to start to go out into the lakes and map up where these invasive plants were so we could project how they were actually moving across Maine. This type of tool we didn't have 2 years ago, but this would have been fantastic for that. How do these ideas actually generalize? I think one of the most interesting types of kind of the spirit of Learning 2.0 and Gov 2.0 is the Connections Project at Rice University. This project now has built a set of like Lego modules of course materials, little fragments of course materials, you might call them learning objects. They've now been strung together, forming over 1,000 textbooks. This is being used worldwide. We have now 1.7 million users of this, 77 million hits, 190 countries are using this. But these things are actually constantly in flux. So everything is being updated. You're stringing things together. You can look at these things as chunks. You can string them together. But the interesting question is if anybody can add materials to this, because the original things like OpenCourseWare had only professors from MIT, et cetera, adding material. Now this is completely blown open, so anybody can add material. Why would you ever want to believe what is actually there? Well, the answer to this is a set of lenses. So now coupled on top of this database is a set of lenses. Some of those lenses carry certain warrants with them in terms of, oh, this is stuff that University of Michigan produced, or this is stuff the University of Michigan has vetted. But also trade associations can do that, Educom can do this, Educause can do this, and so on. So now you have lenses that look over this that give you kind of just views into this amazing Lego toolbox, if you wish. But now you can have some reason to believe, well, if this made it through the MIT professor, maybe you want to trust it, or maybe you want to look up some hackers actually say, you can actually choose your lenses, combine these lenses, and so on and so forth. So it's a very nice approach. But that's just the beginning. This now, from a platform point of view, now couples into an announcement, brand new announcement made last week by Google, by Prasad Ram at Google. It's a new type of a textbook on pads. And what this textbook does is it kind of constantly lets this book get better and better. Not only the more it is used, but people can add new information into it. You can bring experts in. Teachers can actually now communicate to people reading this part of the book, part of a lesson plan, and so on. So it's an attempt to actually bring more life to something that looks more like a textbook, but make it totally fluid at one level, but enable you to bring different types of expertise in to answer questions and so on. Although it was just released in this country, and this is, I would call it a pre-alpha, if at all, but it's now being used, tested out for this year in India, which is turning out to find this thing already beautifully paying off. But let's move into the final phase. If we got this platform notion, how do we think about platforms actually supporting an entire open learning ecosystem? One quote blew my mind. The school is not and cannot be the exclusive provider in a community's education system. There is no one agency, but an ecology of institutions, school, homes, places, worship, television, press, museums, libraries, businesses, factories, and so on, that have to be brought into this. And so as we pull things together, looking at all these resources all over the place, how do we start to think about it as a learning ecosystem that complements the school system in a fairly interesting way? And so if you actually step back and look at where kids spend their time, in home, at school, after school, in terms of their local communities, in terms of virtual global communities, you begin to see that each kid builds a trajectory through this space, partly physical, partly virtual, touching various resources, but this is kind of a random movement. The question is, how do we actually take this and make a structured ecosystem out of it, so that in fact this could amplify the ability to kids to engage in casual learning after school, and also begin to realize that interest groups form in these communities, and how do these interest groups then get kind of more support in their particular community. The two major experiments going on right now, one happens to be in New York, called the New York Learning Network, and one in Chicago. The Chicago one comes out of the public library. This one in New York takes you through a set of the components of playing in terms of the museums in the city and different parts of the city that actually turn out to be support structures for different types of learning communities. And now this has all been networked together for the very first time, so that basically kids can actually have mentors in different drawing on these resources depending on which kind of interest group they want to look at. This is the beginning, I think, of now showing something very interesting, because when teachers begin to see what their students do outside of class, that starts to fold back inside a class, and teachers start reassessing what these kids are capable of actually doing. And I've seen some dramatic examples in Chicago where these kids were completely written off by the teacher. And they go into one of these types of ecosystems, and about 6 months later, the teachers are blown away by saying, what happened? What did you do to these kids? You give them, what new type of drug? Because they're asking questions all the time and so on and so forth. Because they actually started to get into these learning communities, started doing things, making things, and through that process started to get really engaged with content and entered into this more of I'm going to call it a questing disposition. So let me kind of wrap this up by saying, in terms of the kind of platform approach we see to learning 2.0, is we have an incredible number of resources already around, OER being the open education resources and so on. The real question is, how do we start to wrap these things together, tie them together, pulling these different resources in terms of a new type of, let's call it an open participatory learning platform. And the catch, very much in what Jim was talking about earlier, when we do something like this, we then have the ability to collect unbelievable amounts of data. And now if we do the right kinds of data mining over this kind of a process, we can start to absolutely see not only how to make books better, how to make libraries better, but in fact, how to find things that are really turning students on and also how we improve the resources in general comprising the ecosystem. But in the spirit of how Tim opened this and earlier, let's remember one thing as we build these platforms. And what we've all learned, often the hard way, some of us in this room, I know, is let's do it, but let's keep it simple and let it evolve through actual use. With that, thank you.
Thank you very much, CSB.